Mid-90s, my brother started college as your typical sports-loving, girl-chasing dude bro. He didn't care about politics, he wasn't into drugs, and all he cared about was football, partying, and maybe getting himself a degree in business management at the end of it. But then, right at the end of his junior year, he met a girl. I remember the summer it happened, because he kinda just dropped off the face of the earth for a while. It later turned out that he was staying with his new girlfriend's stepdad, but he didn't bother to let anyone know. This upset our mom a bunch, which got dad pissed, and he made it a whole thing when my brother finally did get home, because apparently he was acting weird and withdrawn and all this sort of stuff. This signaled a big change for him, and by his senior year, my brother was almost the polar opposite of his freshman self. He was super into politics. He called himself a psychonaut. And he never, ever left the side of his new girlfriend, who held a share of the blame for his total personality shift. The next thing we know, my brother dropped out of college just 2 months before graduation. He said he didn't want some dumb piece of paper and that, this is the line that freaked my mom out, he, quote, wouldn't need it where he was going. Mom asked what this place was, but my brother refused to say. Then after a little more yelling from dad, he hung up. That was the last we'd see or hear from my brother for almost a whole year. Then, right when we started to think that we might never see him again, who shows up to darken our door but my long-lost big brother? It was a happy time. It was amazing to have him home, but it was a sad time too because he returned a completely broken person. He'd lost a ton of weight, looked like he'd aged 10 years, and he was totally burned out. It was honestly pretty scary to see. But then, where had he been all that time, and what had he been up to? I was kept in the dark on that for the longest time. Mom and Dad just said that he'd been through a rough time of an organ and that he just needed time to recover. I was almost 20, old enough to know better than to go asking any sensitive questions, but I was still curious. It took him a few months before he finally told me what happened. There had been hints here and there, but I never heard the full story. Not until I caught him with a cold one out on the porch one night, way after Mom and Dad had gone to bed. One of their rules was if he was going to live in their house again, he was going to be clean. But after a few months, he finally broke and decided to enjoy a few quiet brewskis all on his lonesome. He told me that he'd give me one if I kept quiet. Then the more of the beer I drank, the less and less inhibited I became regarding certain burning questions. Then finally, right as I'm about halfway through my second can, I finally asked him what happened in Oregon, and after collecting his thoughts for a moment, he started his story. Right around the holidays during his senior year, my brother and his girlfriend, who we'll just call Mia, heard about this community living project up in rural Oregon. They called themselves the Yochiko Co-op. And with the new millennium approaching, they were going to lead the way in terms of ethical and sustainable living. They made arts and crafts, which they then sold at little markets in the city, allowing them to buy whatever they could and forage, hunt, or make themselves. But aside from that, there was no money, no personal possessions. It was total communal living. And my brother and his girlfriend wanted to be a part of it. They were originally going to wait until they graduated before traveling up there, but after getting in touch with someone based in the co-op, they were told it was basically now or never. 1999 was right around the corner, and it meant that the co-op was about to go into overdrive in terms of their mission statement. Recruitment was up, productivity was up, and if my brother and his girlfriend didn't make it up there by late spring, there was a chance that there'd be no space for them. This really sold it for them. The idea of a well-organized and well-led community. And that's what made them think that it could be a place that they could really start a life for themselves. Boy, were they wrong about that? When my brother called to tell our parents that he was dropping out of school, he actually intended to tell them where he was going. He never wanted to make anyone mad or disappoint anyone, but when my dad reacted badly to the whole dropping out thing, he basically thought, screw you, and didn't tell them where he was going. This is also what stopped him from getting in touch with us when things started to go bad at the co-op. He didn't think Mom or Dad wanted to hear from him. I guess partly had a pride too, and the regret of not reaching out was still something that really guilt-tripped him, even many years later. And so off they went up to Oregon, with his real attitude of, "This is our life now, and we're never going back." So they get to Portland, where they meet the contact who had been recruiting them. Then after a brief orientation, they're driven out to a forest encampment in the middle of off the grid. All the money they earned went to medicines, and everything else they got from gardening, foraging, or hunting. No one wanted for anything, because someone else would just share their own, and honestly, from the way he described his first few months of living there, it didn't sound all that bad. The group had like 3 different leaders as well as a council, so there was no single messiah that anyone followed, like a Manson or whatever. There wasn't any immediate red flags, is what I'm trying to say, and far from it actually. It seemed like a really cool place at first. But then, a few months in, things started to get weird. So the closer it got to the turn of the millennium, the more interest the group received from potential recruits. It might sound insane in retrospect, but back then, people were actually really frightened of the turning of the millennium. It was called Y2K. And it was a hugely popular theory back when it was still kind of in its infancy. The theory went that, and don't quote me on this, but when all the digital clocks went from 1999 to all zeros, computers were gonna crash, planes were gonna fall out of the sky. You get the idea. It turned out to be a bunch of nonsense, but in the run-up to it, a lot of otherwise very rational people started believing the hype. Then, because of this, recruitment for the group ballooned over a real short of time. Wealthy middle-aged professionals were having nervous breakdowns, giving all their money to the group's council, then just living like wild men in some big tent. The group attracted another type of person too. People with histories of substance abuse, and although the vast majority were good people who needed a different way to live, there were definitely some bad apples in there too. Before the big influx of new people, no one stole, there was no violence, and although there were a lot of pot and mushrooms and stuff, there was never any hard drug use. And that all changed very quickly. Since people were free to come and go as they pleased, certain people would go back into the city, score some drugs, and then just hitch their way back to the co-op so they could eat for free while freebasing or whatever they were doing. They also never did any work, which was a bigger problem than their drug use by a mile. This ended with a bunch of people getting kicked out, but instead of leaving, it turned violent and the bad apples only backed down at gunpoint. After they left though, lots of people were scared the bad apples would come back, and they were right to be scared, because they did. And one night, a tent fire sent 2 people to the hospital. Neither were smokers, there were no open flames, and the scorch marks on the forest floor outside, it was no accident. It was a deliberate arson attack, possibly by one of the expelled former members. People were really angry. Some wanted to call the cops, others wanted to go after them and deliver some vigilante justice. The co-op's council was equally torn, and they only agreed on one thing, that the local authorities would not be contacted for any purpose whatsoever. It was also decided by a vote of 5-2 that there'd be no kind of proactive retaliation, mostly for the same reasons as above. No one wanted to give the cops a reason to show up and break up the party, and in all likelihood, a bunch of skanky junkies weren't exactly running to the boys in blue. It was the council's view that the best course of action would be to post armed guards around the co-op. That way, any interlopers, as you might call them, could be kept at bay, without risking the overall security of the co-op by giving away its position. You gotta keep in mind that these people were not supposed to be out there, just living out in the middle of the woods, and the co-op had grown so much that no one wanted to have to give it up. Safety and security was absolutely paramount, and nothing else mattered. To cover the whole perimeter of the camp, almost all of the guns and all the experienced hunters needed to be shifted from actual hunting to co-op security. That meant that less food was coming into the co-op, which meant people got hungrier and hungrier, and in the end, people began to steal from each other. Then, when people began to steal from each other, violence increased by 100-fold in a terrifyingly short period of time. People got beat up. One guy got his nose broken, and some other girl was stabbed with a little gardening fork. Meds started going missing too, all kinds of stuff, but mainly pain pills, and it meant that a whole bunch of hungry, anxious people got even more fearful and frightened. And then, just when things seemed that they were just getting better, a girl that we'll call Amber went missing. My brother said that she left all of her stuff behind, just disappeared one night and was never seen again. Naturally, people were worried. People had already started leaving, but no one ever just left all their stuff behind like that, so obviously people were starting to really worry for her. Days went by, people went looking for her, and that's when they found one of the guys they expelled living out there on his own, living off food that had quite clearly come from the co-op stores. I asked my brother how they knew this, and he said it was because of the brand. Either he'd gotten it from the stores or he'd gotten it from friggin' North Carolina or something. It was something that you didn't see out west much, let's just put it that way. But then the thing that got people really mad, as in incredibly livid, was the fact that the guy had a piece of the missing girl's clothing in his possession. My brother said it was never really clear what it was or how he'd come into possession of it, but that the rumors were pretty gnarly. Some suggested he killed her, then took the clothing as a trophy, and as much as the guy denied it, no one seemed to believe him. The people that found him tried to bring it back to the co-op, but in this struggle, the guy pulled a knife and then stabbed one of them. They had to beat the hell out of this guy just to subdue him, and the wounded man was taken to the hospital in the promise that he'd never tell a soul where the co-op was, or who stabbed him. And that last part became real important. My brother said a select few from the co-op security team started questioning the guy, asking him where the missing girl was and why he had her clothing. It was sold on the co-op as an investigation, but they knew it was torture. They knew because they could hear him screaming through the trees. The team had tried to take him as far away from the co-op as they could, but on a quiet, dreary day, they could still hear his faint cries for mercy as the security team worked him over. As brutal as it sounds, a lot of the co-op just didn't care. Even if the guy had nothing to do with Amber's disappearance, there was a chance that he was involved in the arson attack, something the co-op still wanted payback for. Even some of the more civilized of the co-op members didn't condemn what was happening. They were that worn down from weeks of deprivation. If someone needed to get hurt to keep the co-op safe, then so be it. Then came the morning when everyone was roused from their tents or shelters, then summoned to what served as the co-op's town square. There was the prisoner, tied to a tree, beaten to a bloody pulp, but still alive. One of the co-op's leaders, and apparently by far the most hawkish of the bunch, told the gathered crowd that the guy had confessed to killing Amber, but was refusing to say what he'd done with the body. It was pretty obvious the guy would have told them anything they asked him to, just to get the torture to stop. Then, right there in front of everyone, the council member announced that Amber's killer had been sentenced to death, and that his execution would serve as a warning to those both inside and outside the colony. My brother said it was almost impossible to believe that there was a part of him that thought it would be like a mock execution. He joined the co-op because the leadership comprised of some of the kindest, gentlest folks around, but here they were. There's less than a year in, and the experience had almost completely transformed them. My brother never, ever believed that they were capable of something so horrifying. Only, they were. And after the three-man firing squad took up position, aimed, and fired, the prisoner went limp before his clothes started soaking up the blood pouring from his chest. My brother wasn't the only one who thought the whole thing was just some kind of brutal theater. Screams came up from the crowd when the shots rang out, and some started to weep when they realized just how far the co-op had fallen. After that, people started leaving in the middle of the night, just packing up their stuff and disappearing in way bigger numbers than they had before. It got to the point where certain co-op members were being told that they were core members, which was code for, "You're not allowed to leave." Luckily, my brother and his girlfriend weren't on the list. But they still departed under the ruse that they were headed into town to pick up some medicine. To make it look more believable, they all left their stuff behind. All of it. Then they walked to a nearby highway, then went to stay with some old friends over in Portland. A few weeks go by, all is quiet, so my brother's girlfriend figured that they might be able to go back to retrieve some of their stuff, if it hadn't already been appropriated by the rest of the co-op. He calls her crazy, refuses to go, and begs her not to either. Like I just said, there was basically zero chance of her getting any of her stuff back, even the stuff with sentimental value, but she insisted on going alone, even in spite of all my brother's warnings. He figured that they'd either hurt her or somehow convince her to stay, so when she didn't arrive back in Portland when she said she would, he started to worry. Then at some point the next day, he sees a news report about a forest fire and how firefighters had found 3 or 4 charred bodies out near what appeared to be some kind of ad hoc camping spot. The whole co-op or whatever had been left of it had been caught up in a forest fire, either deliberate or natural, and either Mia, my brother's girlfriend, had gotten caught up on it, or she decided to just duck out on him and break off a long-term relationship like she was a deadbeat dad stepping out to pick up some smokes. The people my brother had been staying with weren't exactly his friends, so he wasn't welcome there much longer after Mia didn't come back. And that's when he threw in the towel and made his way back to California, totally wiped. I guess for a lot of people, my brother's story makes for one of the craziest they'd ever heard, and I've had some people question whether or not it actually happened. We didn't see any pictures of the co-op, we didn't meet Mia, and I admit that no one actually knows where he was or what he was doing for that year my brother was missing. But I believe he was living off the grid, and I believe he saw some heavy stuff up there too. Because even after all this time, even after all the improvement he's made, he's still not quite the same guy that left for Oregon all those years ago. I know that no man our age is as full of life as they used to be, but if you'd seen my brother on the day he started college, versus the day he came home from Oregon, you'd have seen it in his eyes. He'd been through hell, and it had taken something from him. One of the most disturbing cases I worked as a detective involved a suspected serial to be heard. We just couldn't track the guy down, no matter how hard we tried, and this was in spite of having some very clear security camera footage of our suspect. He fit the description given to us to a T, and we quickly moved a forensics team into position to try and obtain a usable fingerprint. We got one that we believed was our suspect's, but feeding it through the state and federal databases yielded no matches. Since our victim mentioned grease under her attacker's fingernails, we also showed the guy's picture to every mechanic and machine shop in a tri-county area. But again, we didn't have any luck. The guy paid cash during his transactions, and to our knowledge, he didn't own any kind of vehicle either. For all intent and purpose, the guy was living completely off the grid, which, as you can imagine, posed a huge problem for us. Basically the mainstay of policing these days. Whether it be tracking the use of credit or debit cards, license plate recognition on major highways, or mapping out a suspect's movements using the pings from cell phone towers, gone are the days when we'd rely solely on witness statements and fingerprints. Sure, DNA is a big factor too, but being able to prove when a person was in a particular place, along with why, is how you land those judicial two-punch combos that are almost guaranteed to put the bad guys in jail, usually for as long a spell as possible. But like I already said, we had none of that on this guy. Just a rough image of him with sunglasses and a beard that not a single person seemed to recognize. A few weeks in, we got another victim, telling almost the exact same story as the first, only with a drastically different physical description. We knew it was the same guy. He said all the same stuff to the victim, acted in the same way before and after the attack. Hell, he even had the same accent as our suspect. But without any way to track the guy down and put cuffs on him, he was free to operate with near impunity, and if he kept up his current rate, we were looking at dozens of separate assaults taking place over the following few months. It was a scary situation to be in as a police officer. An active perp, intelligent and motivated. And I didn't have the faintest first idea of how to pick up his trail. In the end, it was pure luck that got us our man. Local PD got a call from some abandoned house out in one of the poorer neighborhoods, big old place too, it's been derelict for years. One of the neighbors said someone had been living there for quite a while and they'd seen them coming in and out a couple of times. They always acted real strange, and since the caller had seen one of the many appeals for it, they decided it was better to be safe than sorry. Turns out the place had been the subject of another report a few weeks earlier. Only this one had been completely disregarded. The call was from someone who sounded audibly disturbed and who claimed the house was haunted by something hungry, quote unquote. The dispatcher logged the call, but neglected to dispatch any units on account of how downright crazy the person sounded. We assume the call came from claimed to have no recollection of it. It's still not clear how the call ties into the case, but we can only assume it does. Anyway, after the second call, a pair of uniformed officers are dispatched to investigate, and upon arriving, they commence a search of the derelict house. They search the ground and first floors and find nothing, but on their way out, they discover an entrance to a basement covered up by an old dresser. They pull it away, rip open the door. Creeped down into the basement, then there you go. They hit the motherlode. There are 2 rooms down there, one that looked like it was stuffed with a whole load of junk, and another that was quite obviously a dark room, you know, the kind old school photographers had to use. Someone had set up a bunch of battery-powered lanterns, each with red filters, and pegged to a bunch of clotheslines were photographs of at least a dozen different women. 2 were later confirmed as our victims. But at the time, the officers had no idea of their find's significance. Obviously, it's not illegal to keep a dark room, so our 2 uniformed officers weren't exactly rushing to call it in, but before they departed, they figured they better search the other basement room, the one with all the junk in it. And that's when they find an old refrigerator, the real tall and deep kind designed to feed larger suburban families. It didn't look out of the place among the other old trash down there, but regardless, something caught one of the officers' eyes during the search. Someone had drilled or bored holes into the fridge's doors. The officer approached, examined the unit for a moment, then pulled open the door. Seconds later, they were calling in a bunch of other police and medical units, with the dispatcher later saying that the cop in question sounded out of his mind with fright. The officer had found an 11-year-old girl. Whoever put her there had bound her hands and feet, gagged her, then left her inside with no access to food or water, and for Lord knows how long too. When asked, the girl had no idea how long she'd been kept prisoner for, but was able to direct officers to both the places she was kidnapped and to the home of her parents. Shockingly, neither parent was even aware their daughter was missing, but leaving her to be staying at a friend's house. CPS got involved at a later date, and that's another story entirely, I guess. Once we'd confirmed that the house was the residence, or at least one residence, of our suspect, we set up a surveillance team which included 2 undercover officers working in shifts. We were pretty sure the guy would return to the house at some point, but he didn't. And we stalked the place for a whole week, but not a single person fitting our suspect's description went anywhere near the house, and in the end, we had to call the surveillance team off to work other cases. And that's where the case really starts to frighten me. I, for one, was so sure that we had him. But either we got extremely unlucky, or he happened to be in the neighborhood at the time his young prisoner was found, or one of 2 realities are true. Either our suspect was working in concert with another criminal, or the suspect was, or continues to be, a serving police officer. We had a few guys retire or leave the department over the next year or so, but no one I really liked to be our suspect. There was also no single officer whose off-duty time coincided with both attacks, which kind of fed into my double suspect theory. Both without any serious evidence. Leveling an accusation of a fellow officer would be a complete waste of time. It's been years now, and whoever attacked our 2 victims before kidnapping the third has still not been brought to justice. I believe that we're dealing with a sophisticated, non-pulsive criminal who had committed at least half a dozen attacks prior to the ones we dealt with. I also have no doubt in my mind that, barring certain unknowable variables, he's still subjecting young, innocent women to ordeals they might never fully recover from. I can only hope that's not the case. But if he's anywhere near as compulsive as I think he is, this is a man who threw his whole life away. choosing to live totally off the grid so he could carry on indulging in his despicable, predatory urges. All the way back in 1989, my little brother Jody had a nervous breakdown. His wife picked a lucky scratch off, then had some airtight divorce papers drawn up before she'd even cashed her winning. Because of the way the state law worked at the time, her unemployment status entitled her to more than half of their physical assets. Then, after her fancy pants West Coast divorce lawyer presented some overly exaggerated evidence of his drinking to the family court, she took the kids too. Jody then hired his own lawyers to try and overturn the court's judgment, spending almost every penny that he had left in the process. The bid failed, and after that he was dead broke, and he spent a very long couple of months just wasting away in our spare bedroom. Eldest daughter asked my wife, "Mommy, what does Uncle Jody do?" My wife replied, "Uncle Jody's up there growing his beard, honey, and it's better he's left alone while he does it." Honestly, that just about summed it up for a while until one day Jody seemed to start getting better. Initially I didn't question it, I was far too happy to see an improvement in him. But then as time went by I found myself wondering what his miracle medicine had been. Just in case I needed a dose of it in the future. When I asked him what his secret was, he told me without a hint of irony, "This time next year, we're going to be multimillionaires." Naturally, I wanted to know what kind of scheme he was cooking up, and that's when he led me down the mother of all get-rich-quick rabbit holes. To help get his mind straight, Jody had started making daily visits to the local library. He said he liked the quiet, and I figured it was simply part of his new sober routine. But the more he read, the more he learned. And then after a while he began to fixate on something. I remember him taking me into our guest room to show me a bunch of maps and geology books. His explanation was manic and sort of fragmented, and he used a lot of terms like ley lines and tectonic plates and really weird ones like vibratory essences. I think he lost me after about 10 seconds of just talking, and I gave him at least another minute or so before I cut him off. He admitted that he didn't know exactly what he was looking for, nor did he know exactly where it was. All he knew is that it was somewhere out in eastern Arizona, near the San Carlos Apache Reservation. To say that I was in two minds about it would be the understatement of the century. On one hand, my brother was clearly obsessing over some crazy tinfoil hat pursuit, while the focus it gave him was making him better. He was showering every day. He quit drinking. He was going out and exercising. Why would I ever want to interrupt that? I figured my best bet was just to let him have his fun, keep an eye on him, and see how it all played out. Things went on that way for a while until one morning I asked my daughter to go wake Uncle Jody up to tell him breakfast was ready. Minutes later, she walked back into the kitchen and told me he was gone. His room was empty. All that remained of him was a handwritten note that he left on the dresser saying, "Gone to Arizona, I'll call when we're rich." That was June 12th of 1989, the last time I ever heard from my brother Jody. Since he hadn't left any way of contacting him, we still weren't entirely sure of his mental well-being, and I reported him missing in Virginia, in Arizona. I even told him that Jody was almost certainly somewhere near the San Carlos, but neither state nor local police had ever found him. By the end of '89, law enforcement had all but given up on finding my brother and, aside from a handful of civilian volunteers, no one was looking for him anymore. I knew I had to take matters into my own hands, but there was no way in hell that I'd be able to find him on my own. Our parents had made Jody and I go to Boy Scouts when we were kids, and he excelled at it. I did not. I'd need help, serious help, and that's when Mr. Calder Hayes stepped in to offer his assistance. You see, Hayes was a self-proclaimed master outdoorsman, so he told me, and specialized in tracking down missing people in mountainous and woodland terrain. He'd worked with a few different police departments all over the country, and he had helped close one or two of those open cases in the process, so I gave him a call and explained our situation. He was a real straight shooter, though, and he told us that he'd work a week for free before asking for any payment. If he couldn't find Jody by then he wasn't in the area. So even if Jody wasn't found, we could at least eliminate the San Carlos as a search area. I took him up on the offer, thanking him from the bottom of my heart, and when I told my wife the news, she broke down into tears of gratitude. By the time Mr. Hayes arrived in Arizona, it was early February, and my wife and I had been in a state of panic for almost 8 months. We were exhausted, emotionally and physically. And our resolve was wearing very quickly. If Jody wanted to be found, he'd have been found, my wife once said, and in many ways, she was right. But it was also her way of saying that there was a good chance that Jody was no longer with us. It was a thought that I couldn't bear to entertain, given how the last words I ever said to him was something to the effect of "get a job." I prayed he'd be found, so I wouldn't have to spend the rest of my life knowing that I'd missed the chance to say goodbye. Within just a few days, we got a call from Mr. Hayes, and despite being prepared for the worst, he sounded hopeful. Along with walking the surrounding hills, Mr. Hayes had toured nearby towns and homesteads showing the locals Jody's picture in the hopes that they might recognize him. And believe it or not, one person did. A part-time checkout girl in a small hardware store said that she was almost certain that he'd stopped by to pick up some construction supplies. After digging through their receipts, they produced evidence that Jody purchased a whole bunch of 2x4s, lattice girders, and batteries, and flashlights, and concrete, and the kind of heavy-duty respirator masks that painters sometimes wear. Hayes ended up asking the store manager what a man might do with the materials like that, and thinking it over for all of 2 seconds, the manager replied, either a basement, or a tunnel, or one or the other. Suddenly, it became clear that we'd been looking in the wrong place. The area around the San Carlos Valley is highly irrigated with sandy earth and chalky rock that would have made tunnel digging a colossal effort. However, the terrain further up north, up near Mount Baldy, is much more suited for excavation. Mr. Hayes asked us to give him a few more days to hike around the mountain, and of course we accepted. Then a few days later, he gave us a call. He'd found a well-camouflaged campsite in the pines up near Mount Baldy. It was in a region that had been covered by aerial search teams, but not any of the ground teams. Hayes told us that there were no signs of Jody himself, but plenty of evidence that the camp belonged to him. Inside of a large but well-concealed tent were all those same pseudoscience books regarding ley lines and spiritual energies and weird stuff like that. On top of that, there was almost $2,000 in cash, a stack of military rations, a water purifier, books on covert evasion techniques, and signs that he had been hunting and foraging for food. He'd been living way off the grid for quite some time, and dotted among the evidence of that were dozens of worn-out picks and shovels. My first instinct was to fly there right away so that I could personally aid in the search efforts, but to my surprise, Hayes issued a stark warning to me. One that appeared to reach deep into the bowels of Mount Baldy. But after briefly exploring it, Hayes had retreated for 2 reasons. Number 1, Jody had most definitely learned to tunnel on the fly, meaning his excavation was far from safe, and number 2, after advancing just 20 or 30 feet into the tunnel, Hayes began to feel lightheaded. And this explained why Jody invested in a respirator. But without properly reinforcing the tunnel, Hayes warned that spending too much time down there would risk both our lives. I heard him loud and clear. It just didn't deter me, because I felt like if I'd done my job as a big brother and stopped him from going down both metaphorical and physical rabbit holes, he wouldn't be missing in the first place. My wife suggested that I simply get back in touch with the local sheriff's department so that they could organize a rescue effort on their end, but I wasn't content to just sit on my butt anymore. Trying to save my baby brother's life using nothing but a freaking telephone. So, that's how I ended up driving all the way out to Arizona while picking up the supplies I needed for the task ahead of me. Calder Hayes told me that he'd guide me to the camp but wouldn't accompany me in the tunnel. He knew he couldn't stop me from going down there and, out of courtesy, he said that he'd hang around to make sure that I made it out okay. But the way he saw it, the tunnel was far too poorly constructed to support even 2 men walking back and forth. It was a dangerous plan, there was no doubt about that, and the smart move was to either splash out on private contractors or to wait for the cops to get back around to organizing another search. But I guess at the time I wasn't in a very smart frame of mind. To me, we'd wasted enough time already, and if Jody was down in that hole, I was going to get him out of it, even if I had to drag him out. It was the morning of August 2nd, 1989, that Mr. Hayes led me up to the foothills of Mount Baldy to where Jody's final abode stood. It was just as raggedy and unkempt as he described, every part of the residence of someone who'd completely lost their mind. Hayes had described how he'd been living off the grid, so to speak, but I didn't really believe it until I saw it for myself. The camp was one thing, but the tunnel? That was another thing entirely. I'd picture something at least 5 or 6 feet wide with something resembling standing headroom. The reality was very different. Jody's tunnel was barely wide enough for a grown man to walk down, and if he did so at a crouch. It was very clear that speed and not precision had been the order of the day, with Hayes claiming that if he's dug any further down the valley, he'd have been buried alive before he got 10 feet down. The idea of climbing down there was a distressing one, but not nearly as distressing as the idea of my baby brother toiling day and night in the dust and darkness without me being there to stop him. Once the respirator was securely attached to my face, Hayes unfurled a long length of sturdy-looking climbing cord and told me to wrap it around my waist. When I asked him why, when he had ourselves a pair of shortwave radios, he told me that he called it a weekly county walkie-talkie on account of all the deep caves in that part of Tennessee. After a certain depth, radios would be useless, and if anything happened to me down there, Hayes needed to know about it. So after tying the cord tight around me, I climbed down the rough plank ladder Jody had hammered into the rock and trudged off into the darkness. Of course, the tunnel didn't remain dark for long. My flashlight saw to that, but once it flickered on, I realized the extent of my brother's work. The tunnel extended deep into the earth, almost like a kind of broad staircase, so that from any one place, you couldn't really tell how deep it went. I must have walked for a good few minutes, treading deeper and deeper into the mountain before my eyes began to sting. It wasn't an unbearable sensation, something sort of like chopping onions, but it made pushing on much more difficult. As I kept on walking, wiping stinging tears from my eyes with the sleeve of my jacket, until there came a point where the tunnel seemed to open into a sort of vast, pitch-black cavern. When I say vast, I really mean it. There must have been at least 100 yards of darkness on either side of me, swallowing up the beam of my flashlight before it could reach any kind of surface. I remember thinking, Jody sure as hell didn't dig this place out. And after walking a few feet further, I saw the rocky cave floor disappear into a sheer drop. It suddenly made sense why my footsteps seemed to echo so much. The cave was even bigger than I'd first imagined. I carefully crept towards the edge of the precipice, shining my flashlight down into it to try and gauge how deep it went. Again, my already powerful flashlight wasn't sufficient to penetrate darkness of that depth. I tried shouting echo to get an idea of how deep and wide the precipice was, but my respirator made it next to impossible to make enough noise to truly gauge it. And around that same time, I ran my flashlight beam along the edge of the cliff and spotted something sticking out from the rock. It was some piece of climbing equipment, a kind of heavy-duty nail that Jody had hammered into the rock before tying a section of rope around it. The rope then extended over the side of the cliff and, although the prospect terrified me, it was clear that Jody's search for whatever it was had taken him God knows how down into the darkness of the cavern below. And that's when I had an idea. I walked back to the narrow tunnel and picked up a pair of fist-sized rocks. Jody's minimalist approach to housekeeping meant that there were plenty of them around, so with one in each hand, I walked back to the cliff edge and tossed one of the rocks into the abyss. I expected maybe a few seconds of silence before impact. It was clearly a long way down, but there had to be a cavern floor down there somewhere, right? But a few seconds dragged on, and on, and on, until it suddenly hit me that I wasn't going to hear any kind of impact at all. I was hit by this sudden sense of vertigo as I realized that the cavern extended deeper than I ever thought possible. I ran over to where the rope was hitched, pulled it up to see just how far my brother had gotten before he either climbed back up or found his way onto some kind of ledge or tunnel mouth. There must have been 100 feet of rope there, easily, and no signs of breakage or snapping either. So if Jody had fallen, it hadn't been as a result of an accident. Dead or alive, he was down there. It must be. Nothing else makes sense. I remember rushing back to the surface to tell Hayes what I had found. The news surprised him, as he wasn't aware that any such cave system existed in the area. The discovery of new subterranean cave networks isn't entirely uncommon, but the question was, how had Jody figured out where it was? I told Hayes all the stuff that he talked about, regarding ley lines and energies and whatnot, thinking that he might recognize the significance of it. But it didn't. It only confused him further. In fact, I think the one thing Hayes was certain of was the search for Jody just got a whole lot more complicated. He seemed to think that state-run search and rescue teams would be reluctant to act on our new information, and when I spoke to them, I found out why. To put it bluntly, the risk-to-reward ratio was skewed way in favor of risk. Given the amount of time that had passed, there was a good chance that Jody was no longer with us. In which case, in keeping in mind that his digging that had been amateur at best, attempting to retrieve his body would pose an unnecessary risk to rescue workers. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the truth. Jody had made his choice, and frankly, it's something of a miracle that he'd managed to dig as deep as he did without getting buried alive. Yet there's still a part of me that just doesn't feel like he's gone. And call me crazy, but I think I'd feel it. But instead of that feeling of loss, of grief that my little brother is gone, all I feel is urgency, frustration, and guilt. Jody's still down there in that cave, and by God, I think by some miracle, he's still alive. If I wasn't as old as I am, I'd be down there again, climbing into that abyss, searching for my brother. But seeing as doing so would be as good as eating my gun, I figured that I'd do the next best thing and try handing things off to another, you see. I'm not asking you or your viewers to go putting yourselves in danger or anything like that, I promise. The last thing I want is for any more folks to get hurt. I'm also not convinced that anyone's going to be able to bring Jody home, not in one piece anyway. All I really want to know is what's down in that cave, and why Jody drove himself half mad trying to find it. It's a mystery that's haunted me for more than 30 years now, and before I die, I'd like to see it solved. I just don't want anyone else's brother or son or father to go down there, only to never see the light of day again.